Do babies feel pain? Does that seem like kind of a ridiculous question to you? What if somebody said, hey, we're going to do a surgery on a newborn? Do we have to do any kind of pain relief? If you're like me, you might hear a question like that and say, what the heck are you talking about? Of course babies can feel pain. This was not always something that was known, believe it or not, even in medical textbooks. In fact, it wasn't until the 80s, 1985 to be particular, the year the Goonies came out. I was 10 years old. I know I don't represent the youth of America, but to me, I cannot believe I lived 10 years before this got any attention. But it wasn't until 1985 when a 5-week-old newborn died after having a medical procedure on their heart that this got any kind of attention, because the mother found out that the procedure didn't involve any kind of pain relief for the infant. And they said, how is that possible? And people stated what was accepted medical knowledge for a long time. They said, oh, well, they can't feel pain at that time. And the mom was skeptical. This got some attention. And then there was a scientific article, a peer-reviewed scholarly research article that came out in 1987 that started to look into this. And guess what? Infants can indeed feel pain. Now you may be wondering how. How would anyone possibly believe that infants are not capable of feeling pain? How was it accepted for so long in medical circles, in medical textbooks? How did this become common knowledge? Well, there are multiple reasons. From a physiological, neurological standpoint, some people proposed ideas such as the brain cells, the neurons, were not the same at that age. They didn't have enough myelination. Myelination is when a fatty insulating covering develops on the sending part of the neurons, so signals are sent faster, more efficiently. And so some people allow that to convince themselves that, well, they don't have that, so the signals aren't sent as fast and efficient, so they're not sending pain signals. It contributed to the idea. That wasn't the only thing going on. Another big issue is the lack of infants' ability to tell you, with no doubt whatsoever, that they are indeed feeling pain, because they can't talk yet. They can't communicate like older folks can do. And so you have sort of this lack of evidence of pain. And so sometimes lack of evidence can let you believe, well, I don't have evidence it's happening, so maybe it's not happening. Another contributing factor is that in the 20th century, in particular in the 20th century, there was this dominant view in the behavioral sciences, in psychology, the behaviorism. Behaviorism, which we associate with folks like John Watson, you might also know names like B.F. Skinner. Watson very much proposed the idea that we should focus on what is observable, what we have evidence for. And part of this was, with the goal of making psychology a true science that studies, that gathers empirical data, empirical evidence, and we test our hypotheses. We're not just making things up, that we have evidence-based practices for anything that's applied from psychology and anything that medicine might apply from psychology. And so there was this dominant view that we should only focus on what we can observe. Infants' perception of pain is internal. It's not being communicated. So you didn't have direct access to it. So it wasn't talked about. It wasn't studied because we couldn't really study it. Certainly not until we could apply more physiological measures to detect whether they could indeed perceive pain. There is also the knowledge that we know that infants' memory is quite limited. And that is true. And so the fact that they can't remember, they can't tell you, hey, remember remember when I was born and I was in a lot of pain? Not only do they not have the communication skills, they don't have the memories that are being formed. And so maybe they don't remember the pain. Does that mean they're not in pain? Yeah, unfortunately, no. Another factor is that historically, pain wasn't always viewed as something that needed to be alleviated, something that needed to be dealt with. For a very long time in history, it was seen as just a normal part of life, and in some cases it was seen as beneficial. In fact, sometimes doctors, healers, they would induce pain to try to bring on healing. And so this is actually a fairly new concept that we should try to reduce pain, that we should try to get rid of it when it's present. Also, there is the factor that when we would do anything for infants, when they were having surgery, when they were having any kind of medical procedure, there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that we didn't want them to move around because those things are squirmy, they move around, they kick. And so there was a lot of emphasis on stopping the movements. And so they would give them medications that would paralyze them so they weren't moving. So they would not provide as much evidence that they were feeling pain because they were feeling the pain, but they're not squirming, they're not moving, they're not shouting. So they're staying still, but still feeling the pain. Another contributing factor is that infants for a long time were sort of seen as lesser, lower beings. So it's like, well, they're lesser, they're not fully human yet, so they don't have all of those human capacities yet. And so that idea, when it was very popular, it allowed people to say, oh yeah, little bitty, almost humans, they can't do this yet. There were even folks who spread the idea that there was research, there was experimental evidence that infants did not feel pain. And so in the 1870s, a researcher, I believe you would pronounce it Gensmer or Gonsmer, he was a German researcher who purposely tried to see if infants could feel pain. He was interested in sensation in general. What could they sense? What could they detect? And so he used pins. He pricked sensitive parts of infants, lots and lots and lots of infants. He pricked them, made them bleed, and he said, and in all these cases, there was no evidence that they felt pain. He did note a slight watering of the eyes in some cases, but he interpreted everything in front of them as the infants did not feel pain. Now, when you read the full account, it's easy for you to say, well, maybe they were, but most people are not reading the full account. They are just reading his, summary account. His summary account sounded like, oh yeah, I tried it out and they did not show any evidence of feeling pain. Other factors that came into play are the fact that when researchers knew that cortical functioning, that the cortex, the part of the brain, that's sort of the top part of the brain where we consider sort of more complex functioning being handled, like areas like the thalamus being involved in pain perception, that since infants had less evidence of cortical functioning, that allowed researchers to say, oh yeah, they don't have, their cortex is not fully functioning, not fully developed yet. So yeah, so they can't do all of these things. Another interpretation that led to the persistence of the myth of infants can't feel pain is the fact that many people interpreted anything that could be interpreted as a reaction to infant pain, that they interpreted as reflexive. Your reflexes, those behaviors that you don't have to learn how to do, you don't have to think about, you don't have conscious control over them, you just do them. Like you hear a loud noise, you go, ah! And you show your startle response. That's a reflex, that's a reflexive response. And so any kind of movement or noises that they made in response to a potentially painful stimulus, they were interpreted as, oh, that's just reflexive. That's not from actually feeling pain. They're just showing reflexes right now. So after the 80s, when we actually started conducting more research into infant pain, we have amassed increasingly large amounts of evidence that yes, indeed, infants, newborns do indeed feel pain. In fact, fetuses in the later part of a pregnancy, the later part, like the third trimester, fetuses can feel pain too, because we now have some procedures, some life-saving procedures that can occur while the fetus is still in the uterus. There's still the pregnancy is still going on, and they might have some procedures, and they say, hey, keep in mind that fetus can be feeling pain, so we have more caution around that. So, have we fixed the problem? Unfortunately, there is still evidence that even though we now recognize that newborns, that infants can feel pain, we may not be giving enough pain relief during procedures. So there are folks who are advocating for us looking into this and making sure that, we're extra cautious and making sure that we are not forcing infants to go through pain, simply because we don't know that they are experiencing that. One final thought. This makes me think of when I got some puppies when I was little. We got some Doberman puppies. And if you know anything about the breed of Dobermans, a lot of times they take their floppy ears and they do this thing where they clip them so they're pointy ears. And when they were telling me about this procedure, they said, oh, no, it's okay. You do it when they're puppies so they don't feel it. They don't feel the pain. And I remember even as a child thinking, wait, is that true? And then my neighbor, who had also had Dobermans, that's where we found out about the Doberman puppies. They're like, oh yeah, they cry and they whimper for the first night, and then they're fine, and they have the ears that are the way that we want them to be. I just remember thinking, why were they whimpering if they didn't feel pain? So, can anybody tell me? Do puppies feel pain? I have the feeling I know the answer to that. Yeah, so we can convince ourselves of all sorts of things, can't we?